At exactly the moment the world wasn't looking, an entire country disappeared from the internet. No warning, no announcement, no official statement, just silence. On January 9th, 2022, North Korea's external digital presence went dark in one sudden synchronized collapse. Government websites failed to load. State-run news portals returned error messages. Email servers that once funneled propaganda and diplomatic signals to the outside world stopped responding altogether. For analysts watching global network traffic in real time, this wasn't a glitch. It wasn't maintenance. It was something far more disturbing: the clean removal of a nation from the global web. Within minutes, intelligence circles in Washington, cybersecurity teams in Silicon Valley, and independent researchers across the country all saw the same anomaly. North Korea hadn't slowed down. It hadn't degraded. It had vanished. Speculation exploded almost immediately. Had the United States launched a covert cyber strike? Was this retaliation for a recent barrage of missile tests? A digital warning shot fired in the shadows of geopolitics. But as experts dug deeper, the story grew stranger. There were no fingerprints, no recognizable tactics, no familiar hallmarks of a nation-state operation. Whatever caused the blackout didn't behave like a government, an intelligence agency, or a military command. And that realization led to a far more unsettling question. If this wasn't the work of a country, then who had the power, the access, and the audacity to take an entire regime offline without being seen? Because somewhere behind this outage was not a declaration of war, but a personal decision, a human one. And once you understand who made that decision, the story of North Korea's internet collapse stops being about geopolitics and starts becoming something much more dangerous: proof that in the digital age, a single individual can quietly reach across borders and rewrite the rules of power itself. 1 year before North Korea's internet collapsed, there was no headline, no outage, no mystery, just a man alone with his screen. In early January 2021, an American cybersecurity researcher, known only by the handle P4X, was doing what he had done thousands of nights before, scrolling through code testing tools, trading ideas with other experts who lived on the edges of the internet's invisible wars. When a fellow researcher sent him a new file, a potential hacking utility, nothing about it raised alarms. This was normal. This was routine. P4X followed protocol, opening the file inside a locked-down virtual machine, isolating it from his real system. At first, it did nothing. No pop-ups, no crashes, no red flags. But the silence didn't last. Within a day, Google published a bombshell security report. North Korean hackers were actively targeting Western cybersecurity researchers using weaponized files designed to implant hidden backdoors. P4X read the post once, then again, and then checked the file he had opened. That's when the realization hit. The tool wasn't inert. It was watching. Waiting. The file contained a concealed doorway, an invitation for foreign intelligence to step inside his machine. North Korea hadn't attacked a corporation or a government network. They had come after him personally. For the first time, P4X understood what it meant to be on the receiving end of a nation-state operation. He had avoided catastrophe by minutes and good habits, but the message was unmistakable. Somewhere in Pyongyang, someone had decided he was worth hacking. The hunters weren't chasing systems anymore. They were hunting the people who knew too much. After the shock faded, P4X did what any rational person would do when targeted by a foreign intelligence service. He reported it. He documented the intrusion attempt, preserved evidence, and waited for the system to respond. An FBI agent eventually reached out. There was a phone call, a calm voice, a series of procedural questions. P4X explained that a hostile nation-state had tried to compromise his machine, that he had narrowly avoided a breach, that others like him were being targeted as part of a coordinated campaign. The agent listened, took notes, thanked him for his cooperation, and that was it. No technical assistance followed. No guidance on hardening his systems. No warning about future risks. No indication that anyone was going to push back. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. And the silence became impossible to ignore. For P4X, the message crystallized slowly but brutally. Being attacked by a foreign government did not make him a priority. In the digital realm, this wasn't treated like an act of aggression. It was treated like an inconvenience, a hazard of the job. The realization cut deeper than the hack itself. He wasn't just exposed, he was expendable. The institutions designed to protect citizens had no clear answer, no visible urgency, no appetite to escalate. And in that vacuum, something dangerous began to form. Not rage, but resolve. If a nation could strike a private individual without consequence, then the rules everyone assumed were already broken. And broken systems don't stay neutral for long. They create pressure. They create resentment. And eventually they create people willing to act where authority refuses to. Once the anger settled into focus, P4X did not rush to retaliate. He did something far more dangerous. He started looking. Quietly, methodically, he turned his attention outward toward the source of the intrusion itself. North Korea's internet had always been spoken of in mythic terms, a sealed digital fortress guarded by paranoia and state control. But myths collapse quickly under scrutiny. As P4X mapped the regime's external infrastructure, the picture that emerged was not one of strength, but of neglect. There were no vast redundant systems, no layered defenses worthy of a nuclear power. Instead, he found a shockingly small footprint, a handful of networks, a few dozen outward-facing websites and software stacks frozen in time, old versions, known vulnerabilities, security holes documented years earlier and never closed. To a trained eye, it was staggering. This wasn't a hardened cyber stronghold. It was a facade, just enough presence to project authority to the outside world, but fragile underneath. The deeper he looked, the clearer it became. North Korea's digital posture relied less on resilience and more on assumption, the belief that no one would dare touch it. That assumption had protected them better than firewalls ever had. And now, sitting alone behind his screen, P4X understood the imbalance. A regime that had reached into his personal machine, that had tried to quietly steal his knowledge, had left its own doors unlocked. The discovery didn't feel triumphant. It felt sobering. Because once you see weakness this clearly, you can't unsee it. And once you know how easily something can fall, restraint becomes a conscious choice, not an illusion. P4X understood that impulse was the enemy. Whatever came next couldn't be emotional, reckless, or loud. If he was going to act alone, it had to be deliberate. So he slowed down. He wrote code, then tore it apart and rewrote it again. Every line mattered. One person cannot manually confront an entire country's network, so automation became the weapon. His scripts were designed to work patiently, almost politely, scanning for live servers, identifying exposed services, exploiting weaknesses that should have been patched years ago. Overwhelming systems just enough to knock them offline, then moving on. No vandalism, no data theft, no digital bloodshed. The goal wasn't destruction, it was denial. To cut the regime's connection to the outside world and nothing more. This wasn't about chaos, it was about precision. As the tools took shape, so did the identity behind them. He chose the name P4X, pronounced Pax, the Latin word for peace. The irony was intentional. Peace enforced not through treaties or missiles, but through consequence, through proof. Each test run deepened the sense that there was no turning back. What he was building wasn't just software. It was a personal threshold. Once crossed, there would be no claiming this was curiosity or research. This would be an action visible to the world, even if his name remained hidden. Late at night, as the scripts ran silently on rented cloud servers, P4X sat with the weight of it. He wasn't seeking fame. He wasn't seeking applause. He was preparing to send a message that institutions had refused to deliver, and messages like that, once written, tend to demand to be sent. The night P4X finally acted looked nothing like history being made. There were no screens filled with dramatic warnings, no countdown clocks, no sense that the world was about to shift. It was an ordinary evening in early 2022, quiet and unremarkable, the kind that disappears into memory for most people. He sat at his desk wearing a t-shirt and pajama pants, the glow of his monitors reflecting off an otherwise dark room. This was not a war room. It was a bedroom. He double-checked the code one last time, not out of doubt, but ritual. Then he pressed enter. Nothing happened at first. No alarms. No instant confirmation. Just packets moving silently across the internet, invisible and indifferent. To pass the time, P4X turned on a movie, forcing himself to act normal to breathe. Every few minutes he paused it and checked the dashboards. The first server stopped responding. Then another. A state-run website timed out. He refreshed. It didn't come back. Slowly the pattern emerged. Air Koryo's booking system went dark. The regime's official web portal followed. State media sites blinked offline one by one. What had felt abstract for months was suddenly real. Monitoring services lit up red outage charts, flattening into silence. Somewhere half a world away, North Korea's connection to the outside world was collapsing, and no one there knew why. P4X felt a strange mix of disbelief and restraint. He didn't celebrate. He watched. Hours passed as the scripts continued their work overwhelming fragile systems, until nearly every external North Korean website was unreachable. By the time he shut everything down, an entire nation's digital voice had been muted by a single individual. He leaned back, stunned not by what he had done, but by how easily it had happened. The world hadn't noticed yet, but it would. By morning, the silence had become impossible to ignore. Analysts around the world began noticing the same anomaly. North Korea's external internet was still down, and nothing was coming back online. In Washington and Silicon Valley, the theories arrived before the facts. This had to be a government operation. Only a nation-state would dare touch something so sensitive. Fingers pointed instinctively toward the United States, toward allied cyber commands, toward some shadowy act of geopolitical retaliation. The timing seemed to fit. Missile tests days earlier. Rising tensions. A digital warning shot delivered quietly. Yet the more experts examined the outage, the less it made sense. There were no telltale signatures, no familiar tactics, none of the complexity usually left behind by state-sponsored operations. It was almost too simple. Inside North Korea, daily life barely registered the disruption. Fewer than 1% of citizens had access to the global internet to begin with. The blackout didn't affect streets or homes. It struck the regime's outward-facing image, the carefully curated portals meant to project strength and legitimacy abroad. That was the real damage. Internationally, the embarrassment was profound. For days, websites flickered online only to vanish again as if someone were flipping a switch at will. No government claimed responsibility. No statement was issued. The mystery deepened, feeding speculation and anxiety in equal measure. And somewhere far from Pyongyang, P4X watched the world misread what was happening. The irony was almost unbearable. Nations debated strategy and intent, never considering the truth that this wasn't geopolitics at work, but a personal reckoning playing out quietly beneath their assumptions. What followed was not relief, but escalation. Success reframed everything. The outage had proven something P4X could no longer ignore. The barrier between individual action and national consequence was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. If one person working alone could silence a regime's digital voice, then the real vulnerability wasn't North Korea's infrastructure. It was the assumption that power still belonged exclusively to states. That realization pushed him beyond retaliation and into ideology. P4X began to think less about what had already happened and more about what would happen next if nothing changed. North Korean hackers would keep targeting researchers. Governments would keep absorbing the damage quietly. Individuals would keep being treated as expendable. So he created something new. On the dark web, he launched a site called the Funk Project, short for FU North Korea. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't a manifesto. It was a signal, a place for others who had been targeted, ignored, or dismissed to gather around a shared idea: accountability through exposure. The reaction was immediate and divided. Some in the cybersecurity community saw P4X as a necessary counterweight, a reminder that unchecked power invites resistance. Others were alarmed. Vigilante hacking, they warned, blurs moral lines and risks collateral damage. What if his actions interfered with covert intelligence operations? What if escalation invited retaliation? No one could contain. P4X understood those risks. He didn't deny them, but in his mind, the greater danger was inertia. A world where no one acts because responsibility is always someone else's problem. And once that belief takes hold, restraint stops being a virtue and starts becoming a liability. As the weeks passed, one fact remained unchanged. No one came for him. No arrest, no warning, no knock at the door. P4X remained anonymous, uncharged, and untouched while North Korea quietly brought pieces of its internet back online under a cloud of unanswered questions. On the surface, the story appeared to fade. But underneath, something irreversible had shifted. A line had been crossed, and it could not be uncrossed. For decades, power in cyberspace had been framed as the domain of governments, vast budgets, classified units, flags, and borders. What P4X exposed was a different reality, that capability, not authority, is what truly matters online. One person with time skill and motivation had achieved what once required an intelligence agency, and that truth is far more destabilizing than any temporary blackout. This story is not ultimately about North Korea. It's about precedent, about what happens when institutions fail quietly and individuals decide to fill the vacuum themselves. P4X never claimed to be a hero. He never claimed to be right. He claimed something more dangerous, that action was possible. And once possibility is proven, it spreads. The question now isn't whether another P4X exists. It's how many are already watching already, learning already, waiting for their own reason. In a world where identities can be hidden, borders bypassed, and consequences delayed, restraint becomes a personal choice rather than an enforced rule. That's the legacy left behind by one man in pajamas in a country briefly cut off from the world. Not a victory, not a defeat, but a warning that the balance of power has quietly changed and no one is quite sure how to put it back. This story isn't really about hacking or even about North Korea. It's about what happens when systems fail quietly and individuals are left exposed. When people feel unprotected long enough, some of them will decide to act, and in the digital age, a single decision can ripple across the world. The real warning here isn't what one person did, but what becomes possible once power slips beyond institutions and into private hands. That question doesn't end with this story. It begins with it. If this investigation made you think, like me the video. If you believe this conversation matters, shares it. And if you want more deep investigative stories like this, subscribe and stay with us.